Okay, here we go again. Part 3 in the Annett saga. We started out by talking about the dichotomy in the Annetts between kind of a conservative pro-monarchy faction and then the free-thinking, anti-religious, kind of more radical thinkers. And I find somebody else has once said that they keep saying, you must be the reincarnation of Peter Annett, Kevin, because you're doing exactly what he did in the 1760s, which is going after, I mean, not only the church and state, but his whole thing was stuff in the Bible doesn't make sense to common reason. Like, you know, could Jesus really have walked on the water? It doesn't make any sense. So he was challenging the Orthodox beliefs. And that was an act of treason. Yeah, back then, if you criticize the church, you're attacking the state and the power of the crown. And it strikes me, when all this work was happening, when I first began to bring out the stuff about the residential schools, the same issue was there. Like, I was taking on both church and state, and they came on down on me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't exactly put in the stocks like he was, but in effect it was, in terms of how they were treating me publicly, and then still do.
If Voltaire may have been able to get away with this sort of stuff in France, and incidentally, Peter Annett influenced Voltaire, but it didn't go in England, and so he ended up in Bridewell prison, and the stocks, as Kev said. And history repeated itself at Stansfield, which you may want to recall.
Stansted Airport, when I got deported out of England just before I was going to speak at a rally at Trafalgar Square. Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. There's these really interesting parallels that go on, you know, these bloodlines, you know, where people keep doing the same stuff all the time over the centuries. And
then if you look at the Annetts in Ontario in the 18th century, and Philip, who we mentioned, picked up the family flintlock and hoofed it into Toronto to join William Lyon Mackenzie in the ill-fated revolution of 1837. He's a light year away from his father, and the ones who followed, like Philip's son was James Calvin Annett, my great-grandfather. And I remember my mother saying, Mom and Dad went to New York, I think it was about 1941. Dad had to visit his agent. And on the way back, they attended an Annett reunion in around Watford somewhere in Ontario. And Mom approached her grandfather, James Calvin, and said, have you read any of Ross's stories, grandfather? And he said, a pack of lies. And that was
He only read the Globe and Mail and the Bible, apparently.
Well, that's a long way from his rebellious father, Philip. And the whole family seems to just swing back and forth these two extremes. And Kevin is the most recent extreme.
Yeah. Well, eventually extremes can become mainstream, so that's what we're hoping for. But no, I've also found that one of the reasons I went this way, it wasn't just because of genetic influence, but I remember the way, you know, being raised by you guys as a kid. You guys used to take us out all the time to visit forts. I mean, I knew more about the Battle of Batoche than most kids do about hockey, right? Because you guys were continually exposing us to history, and I remember you once took us out to Riel's grave in St. Boniface when it was still overgrown with weeds, and explained to us who Louis Riel was when it wasn't politically correct to do that at all, right? So,
well, Mark and I were by no means radical, but we collected forts, all right, and when we were in Ontario particularly to Fort York practically every Sunday afternoon. And
there's a funny story about that. My brother Bill, he knew the routine of what the tour guide was saying to everybody in Fort York. Do you remember that story?
Yeah. Well, you tell it.
Well, Bill and me, I can't remember it, I was too little, but you would take us to Fort York like every Sunday. And that's right on the edge of Toronto back then. Now it's right in the middle of it, but near the lakefront. But the tour guide would always give the standard thing that tour guides give, this rote lecture about what Fort York was. And he used
probably an undergraduate
some
woman
student
on a summer job or something.
Right. So the tour guide used to always say the same thing about note the pewter mugs on the sideboard. And apparently he stuttered and stopped and forgot the line, and little Bill, who was like, 5 years old,
6 or something,
breaks in and says, and note the pewter mugs on the sideboard.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that's, I guess that's Annett's have to be front and center all the time, right?
Yeah.
So about, growing up, how much of family history did you hear about?
Not a heck of a lot. Dad would tell us stuff about him and his two brothers as kids and so on. But along about my teenage years, some maiden aunt of his in Ontario compiled this little, not really a book, but you might say a booklet.
Yeah.
On the family's history, and at that point I learned a lot,
Well, like I mentioned in the previous clip, the town in Frome, England, where we all came from in 1820, Captain Robert Annett got land in Upper Canada, near Watford, Ontario, which is near Sarnia. It's right in the southern
near London.
peninsula, London, between London and Sarnia. I actually went there this last year and hunted around, and we found James's grave, big headstone, because I guess he was fairly well off farmer. Big
Huge
headstone.
beard.
Yeah, but not his dad or granddad, James, or Robert, or Philip, the rebel.
Yeah.
We looked and couldn't find the cemetery anywhere, so maybe it's overgrown now or something. But
There's an interesting little anecdote Dad used to tell about when he came back from the war. James, who was his grandfather, said, Ross, you're really the only one who's been in the service in recent times.
yeah,
You should really have Captain Robert Annett's sword. So the two of them got in a car and they drove out in the boondocks and started visiting various Annett relatives, and one thing led to another, and they came to this hillbilly type shack, and sitting out on the porch in front were a couple of guys that looked like characters out of Lil Abner, I guess. But my great-grandfather said, do you know anything about the whereabouts of Captain Robert Annett's sword? And one guy scratched his head and he looked over at the other guy and he said, Zeke, you remember anything about that sword? And Zeke said, yeah, we cut it up for corn shears.
which is kind of poetic, but too bad. I would have loved to have had
That's what happened to the Annett family in Ontario. They disintegrated from a captain and the Irish Fusiliers' sword to corn shears.
Oh well, and this is Ross Annett, my grandfather and Dad's dad. So we're going to do another clip. Just change the clip. Hold on.